Well, for more on China's role in the United Nations and what it hopes to achieve at this year's General Assembly, I'm joined by Song Zhang. He is the chief correspondent at the Shanghai Wen Hui Daily, and he's here from his Washington, D.C. bureau. Welcome back to the broadcast.
Thank you.
So I wanted to start a little bit with your sense of what we might hear from Wang Yi. I know we have a couple of days to wait before we hear from him in front of the United Nations, but what kind of themes do you think he will touch on, and how will that fit into the sort of framework that we've heard from leaders so far?
And yes, I think especially Wang Yi will be talking about globalism, which President Trump this morning rejected, and this multilateralism and this many other important issues. But at the time when United States, under leadership of President Trump, is withdrawing from the UN affairs, I think China will definitely become more active to lead in many different affairs.
Yeah, it seems like as the United States is pulling back, in many cases, China is stepping forward. Do you think he's going to have any sort of call to action for other countries to participate more heavily in multilateral institutions because of the withdrawal of not just the United States, but other countries that have a pro-nationalist agenda as well?
Yes, and you can see this morning also Wang Yi participated in a minister's meeting on Iran nuclear deals, and China also is becoming more active in this climate change issue and peacekeeping issue. And I think China is definitely calling upon many other UN member countries to join this different global affairs at the time when President Trump and United States is stepping back.
We've heard a little bit about this mechanism that China, Russia, and the EU are going to be working on to circumvent the U.S. in terms of the sanctions that they're imposing on Iran. Do you know anything further about how that's going to work?
I think these countries are trying to work together to make this JCPOA to continue, and they're together certifying that Iran is fulfilling its responsibility, especially on the issue of nuclear. And these countries are also trying to lobby that the United States should one day return back to this JCPOA, or we can work together to make this JCPOA a little bit more kind of rectified or become more inclusive. But it's difficult to say whether these efforts will be finally successful, because as long as the United States will insist to sanction those kind of countries or companies who are doing business with Iran, it will be very complicated to predict.
Well, the peacekeeping contribution of China has steadily grown. Can you talk a little bit about the vision that China has for its role in the United Nations in that respect?
I think China is becoming more active in these issues because it feels that in many like African countries, South Asian countries, these kind of peacekeeping issues are becoming very urgent, and China is now capable, and China is willing to do that. And also, China is also implementing its OBOR, and when these kind of areas will become more stable and peaceful, and China will also benefit. Many regional countries also will benefit.
You know, we talked about places where the U.S. is pulling back, that China is stepping in. One area could also be a contribution financially to the United Nations. Do you expect any announcements in that regard?
Especially on this financial, I think China is already providing a lot of funds to many different developing countries. You see the recent summit between China and African countries. China has extended $60 billion economic assistance to African countries, and China will be expanding that. And also, we are trying to invest in this more than 70 countries where this OBOR will be going. I think that's another way to assist those kind of countries.
Lastly, I just want to bring up the area of cooperation around counter-narcotics. This has actually been a bright spot in the China-U.S. relationship, something that both countries are committed to. Beijing has a role to play there. Can you talk a little bit about, the United Nations has started with this call to action, really, on this issue. Can you talk a little bit about China's role there?
Anti-drug?
Yes.
Yeah, I think China is committed to that. China is a part of this meeting where America has been called. And I think China will be willing to work together with America, especially when Mr. Trump was talking about this. I don't know what is the name of that drugs, but
the opioid crisis.
Yeah,
or fentanyl.
yes.
Yeah.
I think China has committed to cooperation more closely, and it's complicated in China because it's being sold basically through those cyber activities. So I think Chinese authorities is trying to become more active and to become more like constructive how to stop these kind of things from coming to America.
Well, Song Zhang, we certainly covered a lot of ground there. Thanks for coming in. We appreciate your perspective.